Before we dive into it, so what's the importance of history in apologetics? Because I'm guilty of studying mostly the biblical approach, since I think it would be hard for sola scriptura Protestants to acknowledge the history of the church. So I guess my question is, how important is church history in apologetics, and how do we convince Protestants to look into it as well?
Yeah, I guess first thing I'd say is I don't think it's a fault to focus more on the scriptural data,
Mm.
because I think that's really good.
Mm.
At the same time, it's easy for Catholic apologists to start thinking as if sola scriptura is true, even though they logically know it isn't, because they're constantly defending
Yes.
Catholic teachings in a sola scriptura way.
Mm.
That you can kind of live like sola scriptura is true, even while you know at the back of your mind, like, well, it doesn't really make sense. It doesn't really work. But nevertheless, like, certainly if you're going to persuade someone to find the thing that you and the other person agree on as an authority is an easy place to start. So it's a sound approach within those limits. But nevertheless, I begin the book by pointing out that really, if you're going to make a critique of the Catholic Church, whether you're a Catholic or a Protestant, a Muslim, an atheist, whoever you are, if you're going to say the Catholic Church's teaching is wrong, you really are going to say one of two things. One, you could be saying, yeah, Catholics believe what Jesus taught, but I disagree with Jesus. Okay, well, if that's the problem, then this is not really the book that's going to answer that. You just need a book about why we should believe in Jesus. C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, Ronald Knox's The Belief of Catholics. Any of these books could do a good job of saying, well, why believe in Jesus Christ? But the other kind of position you could take is that, well, no, I agree with Jesus's original teachings, but somewhere along the way, his followers screwed it up. And that screw up became the Catholic Church. And there's different forms of that. Dan Brown had his popular book, Da Vinci Code, in which he makes kind of a secular version of that argument. Muslims make a version of that argument, and Protestants make a version of that argument. So those are all different forms of saying, okay, Jesus taught A, and I agree with A. Somewhere along the way, doctrine B entered the picture, and I disagree with B. Well, here's the thing about that, and here's why that's important, is that's a historical claim. That somewhere along the way, people stopped believing the true thing and started believing the false things. Well, we can historically verify whether that's true or not. If you say, Jesus originally taught reincarnation and his followers don't, well, we should be able to find out if that's true. Or if you say Jesus originally taught sola scriptura, or Jesus rejected the idea of bishops, and the early Christians didn't have bishops, and they came somewhere further down the road. Great. Well, when did they come in? What year do we have the first pope? What year do we have the first bishops? Who was the first pope? Who was the first bishop? Where were the controversies around that? Because if you have a group of Christ followers who are ready to die for his teaching, and then you say, but somewhere along the way, someone introduced a heresy and people fell for it, seems like there would be a big outcry over that. It seems like you'd have a lot of people saying, hey, no, this new teaching is false. Don't listen to that teaching, listen to the old teaching, especially because you have these kind of warnings in scripture that in future days, people will grow tired of hearing the truth, and having itching ears will turn away from the truth and entertain falsehoods. That sort of mentality is something Christians were on guard against. The Christians were theologically conservative. Now, by theologically conservative, I don't mean any kind of political thing. I mean that they held on to the thing that they received and were resistant to anything that sounded new. And they would make arguments against beliefs by literally appealing to the fact that they'd never heard of them before, by appealing to the fact that this is not what they were taught in Christianity. And then we find that kind of approach really early on in Christianity. And so someone who's saying that a false belief nevertheless entered really has a preponderance of evidence they should be able to present to show, well, this is how that false teaching overtook people. Here's when, here's who did it, here's how, either here was the outcry or here's why there wasn't an outcry, all of those pieces. If you can't do that, I think your historical claim is just false. That because if that didn't happen, if there's no point in history in which we can say, here is where Christians switched from worshiping on Saturday to Sunday, or here's where they went from having a congregational governance to having bishops, or whatever it is. if you can't point to that shift, then I'm left to say, no, I think that this is actually what was taught by Jesus and the apostles, because we find it as far back as we go. And so then we're back to, well, do you disagree with Jesus or not?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. It seems like it will be an unfalsifiable claim to say that something has changed during the course of time, but you cannot pinpoint when it happened. You're just saying it happened, but we don't know when.
Yeah. So a lot of times Protestants will say that it happened slowly over time. Regularly I will say, who do you think was the first pope? And they'll say things like, well, it depends what you mean by pope. And it's really hard to say. And, the Bishop of Rome had more and more authority going forward. And it's like, okay, well, where do you think it fell into error?
Yeah.
And so it tends to be a very vague kind of answer. And so purposely in this book, if you're going to say it happens slowly over time, well, you're really looking at several centuries, right? You can't say it happens slowly over time over, 6 months. You're looking at a long period of time. And so in the early church, which was the Catholic Church, I really try to focus just on about the year 200 and prior.
Yes.
By saying, look at how Catholic they were in 180. Look at how Catholic they were in 160. Look at how Catholic they were in 107. And if you're going to say they fell into error, well, you can't say it happened really slowly, because you haven't left yourself enough time for that. You have to say it happened very quickly. And so then you should be able to give a much more coherent kind of story. If the apostles taught one thing and a few days later, everyone's believing something else, I want to know why.
Yeah. I guess, Joe, in a nutshell, for our listeners who are not familiar with church history or early church history, who are the players there, and why are they important?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are a number of players. It's a manageable number, right? But there are a number of players. So you have, for instance, the last of the apostles is the Apostle John. And we know 2 of his students. One of them is St. Ignatius, who is the Bishop of Antioch. And the other one is St. Polycarp, who is Bishop of Smyrna. And Polycarp, we have an account of his martyrdom written from within about a year of his death. It was under a year from when he was martyred. Those who'd witnessed his martyrdom wrote about it. And they mentioned that he had served Christ for 84 years. So, this is one of the things that he says at the trial. And so we know, or 86 years, I guess it was, because he was born in 69 and died in 155. And so we can point to pretty concretely, okay, well, John dies approximately 100. Polycarp lives from the year 69 to the year 155. And Polycarp is the mentor of Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, who was born in 130 and dies probably 202. We don't know exactly when he dies. But in any case, we can say, okay, here's 3 generations, like grandfather, father, son sort of thing, where you have the Apostle John teaching Christianity to Polycarp, who was an adult disciple and, was a follower of the Lord for 31 years by the time John dies. And then when he dies, Irenaeus is 25. So this is not like, the mentor dies when they're 7 years old and they try to remember later on. Like, no, these are people who had literally decades of growth in Christianity, who knew Christianity either from an apostle or from someone who'd learned Christianity from an apostle. And that puts them in a good position to be able to say, well, here's what that means. For instance, if we're going to talk about, well, what does John 6 mean when Jesus talks about the Eucharist? Yep. Well, you look at the fact that St. Ignatius, who is writing in about 107, 7 years after John dies, having learned Christianity from John, believes in the real presence of the Eucharist and treats it as just a given that that's true. Well, how do you make sense of that? It doesn't seem plausible to say he fell into error that quickly. It doesn't seem plausible that someone who's gotten Christianity from John would have such a bad understanding of what John's gospel meant. I'm not saying he's infallible, but he certainly is in a better position to understand John's gospel than we are. We can have all the commentaries on all the bookshelves in the world, and it's not going to be as good as having a living evangelist who wrote the gospel, who can tell you what he meant by a part you don't understand. So that's what, so those are the kind of figures we're looking at. Ignatius, Irenaeus, Polycarp, some others as well. Justin Martyr, who's written in about 160, explaining Christianity to a non-Christian audience. So you have these guys who are really early on, who are known for their orthodoxy, who in many cases die for the faith. Certainly that's true of Ignatius, that's true of Justin. That may be true of Irenaeus, although it's less clear in his case, and it's certainly true of Polycarp. So these are people who lived and died for the gospel. These are people who fought for orthodoxy within Christianity and defended Christianity from paganism on the outside.
Okay.
So those are the kind of people. Like, these are people that we should all, as Christians, look up to and revere. And we should ask, well, what did they think Christian teaching was?
Right. And I like how you put it in the book that these are the people who were the key players when the faith really exploded.
Yes.
Meaning, whatever form we have, the essentials of our faith are because of these people. So it would really be crazy not to look at what they were saying.
Yeah. I mean, even if, Protestants who may be listening, you've still gotten Christianity from the Catholic Church. If there was no Catholic Church, and if these early Catholics hadn't existed, the faith doesn't seem to spread past Judea, because if you look at who spreads it, who were the people spreading Christianity at the cost of their own life? Well, if you say, well, they're all a bunch of heretics, that's such a strange view to say, like, oh yeah, these people taught me Christianity and they were all wrong, but I know better than all of them, even though they had the apostles to learn about it from. Like, that's kind of a weird view to have of the people who are the reason any of us know about Christianity today, because these were the ones who spread it at the cost of their own lives.
Perfect.
Hi, this is Jay Aruga of the Jay Aruga Show. If you like what you just saw, please consider subscribing and smash that like button. We'll need all of your help to take back the culture from this ideological colonization of the West. Thank you.